There's a secret, one that's been deliberately buried from humanity for nearly 2,000 years. A method of prayer so potent, those in power did everything they could to keep it out of your hands. Today, you're going to find out what the Lost Essene texts really spill about how Jesus prayed, and why that practice got systematically scrubbed from the traditional Christian teachings we've all grown up with. Just picture it for a second. Everything you thought you knew about prayer, incomplete. Like there's this lost dimension, a master key that totally flips the script on the spiritual experience. Those manuscripts they dug up in the Dead Sea caves aren't just dusty historical relics. They're gateways to a wisdom that could absolutely revolutionize your spiritual life in ways you've never even dreamed possible. For centuries, scholars and archaeologists hunted for clues to nail down Jesus's original teachings. But when they finally hit pay dirt, something wild went down. A lot of those finds got hustled out of public view, locked away in vaults by institutions that prefer to keep certain knowledge far from the average Joe. Why the cover-up? What's so damn revolutionary about these texts that it scares the living daylights out of the establishment? The answer lies with a spiritual community that was around more than 200 years before Jesus's birth. The Essenes weren't just another religious clique. They were the keepers of ancient knowledge about the deep mechanics of reality, about how human consciousness can interact with the invisible forces running the universe. And Jesus, based on evidence we're going to dig into today, didn't just know these teachings. He mastered them in a way that utterly transformed human history. When you really get how the Essenes taught the art of prayer, you realize it wasn't just about asking or thanking some higher power. It was a process, scientific and spiritual all at once. A consciousness tech that lets you align your inner frequency with the universal laws governing reality's manifestation. That's why the miracles attributed to Jesus weren't violations of natural laws. They were perfect demonstrations of how those laws really work when applied with knowledge and precision. The Essene texts lay out specific methods for mental, emotional, and energetic prep that come before any truly effective prayer. They knew a scattered mind and a conflicted heart couldn't generate the coherence needed for prayer to get past empty words and become a real transformative force. So they cooked up sophisticated techniques for inner purification, not out of religious moralizing, but out of practical necessity. Only a clean, focused consciousness can tap into the elevated states where prayer really packs a punch. What really hits you in these manuscripts is the detailed rundown of how Jesus prepped before his most intense prayer sessions. These weren't just quick reflection breaks. They were genuine energetic alignment rituals where he deployed specific breathing, visualization, and mental concentration techniques the Essenes had safeguarded for generations. These practices weren't primitive superstitions. They were methods rooted in a deep understanding of how human consciousness can directly influence the very fabric of physical reality. Recent deep dives into neuroscience and quantum physics are starting to scientifically back up what the Essenes already knew millennia ago. Focused, coherent consciousness has the power to collapse quantum possibilities into specific realities. When Jesus multiplied loaves, healed the sick, or turned water into wine, he was demonstrating principles modern science is just now scratching the surface of. The Essenes called it the law of conscious manifestation, and their texts are packed with precise instructions on how to apply that law through specific prayer methods. But here's the most unsettling part of this whole saga. When the early leaders of the institutional Christian church got their hands on these teachings, they made a conscious call to suppress them. Not because they were false or dangerous, but because they were too true. A populace that masters the real methods of prayer doesn't need religious middlemen, doesn't rely on institutions to tap into the divine, doesn't passively swallow doctrines that limit their spiritual potential. That's a spiritually empowered populace, and that spelled a direct threat to the control wielded by the power structures of the day. If you're watching this, chances are you feel, deep down, that there's something more profound waiting to be uncovered on your spiritual journey. If you resonate with the gut feeling that conventional prayer methods, while sincere, just feel limited compared to the potential you instinctively know is out there, then you're ready to grasp what the Essene texts truly teach. If you sense your spiritual life could be more transformative, more tangible, more hooked up to practical, measurable results, then you gotta understand why these teachings were hidden and how you can start putting them to work today. The Essenes popped up as a distinct spiritual community around the 2nd century BC. settling mostly in the Dead Sea region, in a spot we now know as Qumran. But unlike other religious groups back then, the Essenes weren't just scholars of traditional scriptures. They were active investigators of existence's deepest mysteries, dedicating their entire lives to cooking up practical methods for accessing elevated states of consciousness and manifesting tangible transformations in physical reality. Archaeological digs show that the Qumran community operated like a bona fide spiritual university, where ancient knowledge was preserved, studied, and refined over generations of dedicated practitioners. They kept extensive libraries, not just of Jewish texts, but wisdom from Egyptian, Persian, Greek, and even more far-flung cultures. It was a cosmopolitan hub of spiritual know-how, where the best consciousness development techniques from diverse traditions were synthesized and perfected. What makes the Essenes stand out in history isn't just what they preserved, but how they applied that knowledge. Their texts detail systematic methods for what they dubbed mind purification, heart alignment, and energetic harmonization. These weren't abstract concepts. They were specific practices with detailed instructions on body posture, breathing patterns, visualization sequences, and mental concentration techniques. It was a true science of consciousness, honed over centuries of experimentation and refinement. And you gotta hit that subscribe button right now, because what we're about to drop is gonna completely transform how you see the true potential of prayer. Also ding that notification bell so you don't miss any of the secrets we're unearthing about these lost teachings that can revolutionize your spiritual life. Every video we put out peels back another layer of this ancient puzzle, deliberately broken up to keep you in the dark about your real spiritual power. The Qumran manuscripts spill that the Essenes cooked up what they called the 7 keys to effective prayer. These weren't just moral guidelines. They were precise consciousness technologies that let the practitioner tune into what they referred to as the frequency of manifestation. The first key involved specific physical and mental prep techniques, including purifying fasts, ritual energetic cleansing baths, and periods of total silent isolation. The second key dealt with emotional alignment, where the practitioner learned to pinpoint and dissolve emotional blocks that kept spiritual energy from flowing freely. The third key was arguably the most groundbreaking, developing inner vision, a knack for perceiving realities beyond the normal physical spectrum. The Essenes taught specific meditation techniques that allowed access to states of consciousness where conventional laws of space and time got malleable. It was in these states that true prayer went down, not as a plea aimed at some distant deity, but as conscious participation in the universe's fundamental creative process. The fourth and fifth keys revolved around what the texts call intention anchoring and faith amplification. This wasn't about blind belief, but cultivating a state of certainty based on direct experience of spiritual principles in action. The Essenes put together practical exercises where beginners learned to manifest small transformations in physical reality, gradually building the confidence and skill needed for more powerful prayers. The sixth key spilled the secrets of cosmic timing, how to sync prayers with natural and energetic cycles that amp up their effectiveness. The Essenes were masters of astronomy and astrology, not out of superstition, but because they got that the universe operates through precise rhythmic patterns. Knowing when to pray, just as much as how to pray, was critical for maxing out results. The seventh and final key was maybe the most mysterious, the technique of wordless prayer. The texts describe states of direct communion where the practitioner's consciousness temporarily dissolved into universal consciousness, allowing for communication that completely transcended verbal language. It was in these moments that the most extraordinary miracles showed up because the separation between the one praying and the universe simply ceased to exist. Historical evidence suggests Jesus didn't just know these teachings, he'd mastered them exceptionally. His ability to slip into deep meditative states, to scope out people's spiritual needs just by looking at them, to pull off instant healings and physical matter transformations, all of it lines up exactly with the Essene Text's descriptions of the expected outcomes when those 7 keys are perfectly applied. The canonical Gospels preserve fragmented echoes of these teachings, but they're so watered down, their real essence got lost. When Jesus taught his disciples to pray, he wasn't just handing them a verbal formula. He was onboarding them to the basic principles of a spiritual technology he'd honed through years of intensive practice with the Essene methods. What makes these teachings even more off the charts is how Jesus adapted and universalized them beyond the Essenes' closed circles. while the Dead Sea community kept their secrets under lock and key, available only to initiates who spent years in prep. Jesus figured out ways to pass on the essence of this wisdom so everyday folks could grasp and apply it. Modern investigations of the manuscripts suggest Jesus cooked up a kind of simplified version of the 7 keys, keeping their transformative power intact, but making them accessible to fishermen, tax collectors, prostitutes, and others who'd never get a sniff of the traditional esoteric teachings. Jesus' genius lay in his knack for teaching through parables that worked on multiple levels. For casual listeners, they were simple moral tales. For those with ears to hear, they held coded instructions on how to apply the Essene prayer principles in daily life. The parable of the sower, for instance, wasn't just a lesson on spiritual receptivity. It was a detailed map of the different states of consciousness needed for prayer to bear tangible fruit. The seeds represented intentions planted through prayer, while the different soil types described the various levels of mental and emotional prep that determine whether a prayer manifests or not. Experts who've dug into the Gospel's linguistic patterns found that certain phrases attributed to Jesus hold syntactic structures that pop up in the more advanced Essene texts. When Jesus talked about ask and you shall receive, seek and you shall find, knock and the door will be open to you, he wasn't just dropping vague religious metaphors about perseverance. He was handing down a precise technical sequence to activate the spiritual mechanisms governing manifestation. These were operational instructions for a consciousness tech that few back then fully grasped. The Essene texts reveal that effective prayer calls for 3 fundamental preparations that Jesus folded into his public teachings. The first is what they dubbed emotional field purification. Before trying to influence external reality, the practitioner has to hit a state of genuine inner peace, free from emotional conflicts that could distort or block the intention's transmission. Jesus translated this into lessons on forgiveness, loving your enemies, and letting go of material worries. When he told his followers to forgive 70 times 7 or not to sweat the small stuff, he wasn't just pushing a passive stance on life. He was teaching specific techniques to keep the personal energy field clean and receptive. The second prep involved aligning with what the Essenes called cosmic will. This wasn't about blindly submitting to fate, but developing the knack for perceiving and cooperating with the universe's natural evolutionary trends. Jesus showed off this skill when he knew the exact right time for every action, when he sensed people's deepest needs before they even voiced them, when he picked words that hit the precise core of his listeners' spiritual issues. This fine-tuning with universal rhythms is what let his prayers churn out results that seemed impossible to outside observers. The third prep, maybe the toughest, was what the texts refer to as the dissolution of the separate ego. For prayer to work at its peak potency, a person has to temporarily transcend identifying with their limited personality and recognize themselves as a conscious expression of the same creative force that moves the stars and makes plants grow. Jesus showed this transcendence when he spoke with natural authority about universal truths, when his words carried a power that went beyond his human personality, when his very presence seemed to shift the spiritual vibe of entire rooms. Historical sources hold accounts that Jesus often dipped out to isolated spots to practice advanced forms of prayer that demanded absolute silence and deep focus. These weren't just quick religious reflections. They were intensive sessions where he deployed the most sophisticated Essene techniques to tap into states of consciousness that allowed direct intervention in the energetic patterns underlying physical reality. It was after these sessions that the most extraordinary events of his ministry frequently went down. Instant healings, food multiplication, control over natural elements. The prayer method Jesus practiced on the down low wasn't based on verbal pleas directed at some distant anthropomorphic deity. It was a form of direct communion with the universe's organizing intelligence, a technology to consciously participate in the fundamental creative processes governing reality's manifestation. The Essene texts describe this practice as breathing with the cosmos, a state where individual consciousness perfectly syncs with universal rhythms, allowing seemingly miraculous transformations to go down through natural principles most people are clueless about. Recent deep dives suggest Jesus developed specific variations of this spiritual tech for different kinds of situations. There were methods for physical healing that involved directly perceiving the energetic patterns upholding bodily health, and techniques to reconfigure those patterns when needed. There were approaches for emotional transformation that operated by transmitting vibrational frequencies capable of dissolving psychological blocks and restoring the psyche's natural balance. There were procedures for influencing external circumstances that worked by consciously manipulating the currents of probability that determine how events unfold in time and space. Evidence points to the fact that Jesus didn't just master these techniques individually. He'd also figured out how to combine them in ways that exponentially amped up their effects. When he prayed, he wasn't just deploying a single method. He was orchestrating multiple spiritual technologies simultaneously, creating fields of transformation so powerful they could instantly alter the very structure of local reality. It was this technical mastery, coupled with his genuine compassion and purity of intention, that churned out the extraordinary phenomena witnesses described with a mix of awe and bewilderment. What really blows you away in the Essene records about Jesus' secret practices is how they spill a profoundly sophisticated grasp of reality's multidimensional nature. While most spiritual traditions back then operated with relatively simple concepts about divinity and prayer, the Essenes had cooked up a detailed mapping of existence's different levels and the specific methods needed to consciously interact with each one. Jesus didn't just soak up this knowledge. He apparently refined it in ways that even surprised his most seasoned Essene teachers. The Lost Texts describe how Jesus figured out that the effectiveness of secret prayer hinged fundamentally on the ability to simultaneously access multiple dimensions of consciousness. It wasn't enough to just quiet the mind or focus attention. You had to learn to operate from a state of being that completely transcended the limitations of ordinary perception. This state, which the Essenes called cosmic breath, involved such a deep synchronization with universal rhythms that the distinction between the one praying and the cosmos simply vanished. In that state, Jesus didn't pray to the universe. He prayed as the universe, his intentions becoming direct expressions of the fundamental creative will. Investigations indicate Jesus developed specific techniques to rapidly drop into this transformed state of consciousness, even under challenging circumstances. While other practitioners needed hours of prep in controlled environments, Jesus could instantly tap into these deep levels of cosmic communion, even in the middle of crowds or during intensely stressful situations. This wasn't some natural talent. It was the result of years of intensive training with Essene masters who'd safeguarded techniques honed over centuries of spiritual experimentation. Jesus had perfected methods to use breath, movement, and subtle shifts in posture, focused visual attention, and precise modulation of awareness. These were the keys, almost instantly creating the internal conditions necessary for transformative prayer. What makes these findings particularly compelling is how they lay bare Jesus' understanding of prayer as a precise science, not some vague religious pursuit. The Essene texts aren't shy about detailing how he meticulously analyzed the energetic conditions of any given situation before nailing down the specific approach that would hit hardest. For physical healing, he'd first size up the vibrational patterns causing the imbalance, then apply specific frequencies through his prayer to snap things back into natural harmony. For emotional shakeups, he'd pinpoint the underlying psychic blocks and deploy targeted techniques to dissolve those obstructions, letting the natural current of well-being flow freely again. Historical records back this up, showing Jesus often pulled all-nighters, pushing the envelope with advanced variations of these techniques, exploring their limits and discovering fresh possibilities. He'd figured out that the Essenes' secret prayer method was just the entry point to something much bigger. Through systematic experimentation, he developed ways to influence weather patterns, communicate telepathically over vast distances, and tap into intel about events far removed in time and space. These weren't random supernatural stunts. They were disciplined applications of spiritual scientific principles he'd mastered through intensive study and practice. Experts have uncovered that Jesus had mapped specific correlations between internal states of consciousness and observable external phenomena. He knew exactly how to tweak his breathing to generate resonances that impacted plant growth. He grasped how to use specific patterns of mental concentration to influence animal behavior. He charted the vibrational frequencies that could speed up healing or slow down decay. This wasn't mystical in some airy-fairy sense. It represented a hard-nosed, practical grasp of universal laws that modern science is only just beginning to rediscover. What really jumps out from the records is how Jesus integrated this advanced spiritual tech with genuine compassion and a deep-seated understanding of human nature. He didn't use these techniques to grandstand or control. It was always in service of the well-being and spiritual growth of those around him. The Essene texts hammer home that Jesus saw the transformative power of secret prayer as a sacred trust, never a tool for personal gain or domination. That purity of motive, coupled with his exceptional technical mastery, created a unique resonance that dramatically amplified the punch of his practices. Studies suggest Jesus had stumbled upon something even the most advanced Essene masters hadn't quite cracked: how to use secret prayer not just for temporary fixes, but to instigate permanent shifts in the underlying fabric of reality itself. His interventions weren't just surface-level alterations. They tweaked the fundamental causal patterns dictating how events played out over time. That's why folks healed by Jesus often experience transformations far beyond just ditching specific symptoms. Their whole lives got rewired, opening up entirely new avenues for growth and fulfillment. The Lost Texts reveal that Jesus developed methods to teach simplified versions of these techniques to his inner circle, though it seems none of them ever hit his level of mastery. He understood these practices demanded not just technical training, but a fundamental overhaul of personality that completely purged egocentric motives. The Essene secret prayer operated on principles that simply weren't compatible with desires for personal power or social recognition. Only someone who had entirely transcended those drives could tap into the deepest wells of transformative effectiveness. The game-changing power of the secret prayer practices Jesus developed sent ripple effects far beyond his immediate physical presence. Investigations show that communities directly exposed to his teachings experienced social and spiritual shifts that held up for generations. We're not talking about just groups inspired by a nice message. These were entire communities that had learned to apply practical principles of collective transformation. The Essene texts preserve detailed accounts of how Jesus coached entire groups to coordinate their prayer practices in ways that generated amplified energetic fields. These collective fields could sway local weather patterns, boost agricultural yields, and even rework the social dynamics of whole communities. Experts have uncovered that Jesus had identified specific correlations between coordinated spiritual practices and measurable transformations in the physical world. The techniques he cooked up for group work represented a significant evolution beyond the traditional individual practices of the Essenes. While Essene community methods largely honed in on personal purification and group harmony, Jesus had figured out how to harness collective synergy to spark changes that manifested in the physical world in objectively observable ways. Studies suggest he grasped principles of collective resonance that allowed synchronized groups to create effects exponentially greater than the sum of their individual efforts. These weren't vague mystical phenomena, but disciplined applications of natural laws operating through specific reproducible mechanisms. The preserved records indicate that Jesus taught his communities to set up regular cycles of collective practice that gradually transformed the energetic quality of entire geographical regions. These transformations showed up as observable changes in people's health, the vitality of local ecosystems, and the prevalence of social conflicts. Communities consistently applying Jesus's methods reported dramatic drops in illness, substantial bumps in agricultural productivity, and spontaneous resolutions to disputes that had been simmering for decades. Evidence points to the fact that Jesus had figured out how to use secret prayer to generate changes that propagated through entire social networks, following predictable patterns. What's most striking in the texts is how Jesus wove these transformative practices with profound ethical teachings, ensuring the power developed would be used exclusively for the common good. He understood that advanced spiritual abilities could be incredibly dangerous if wielded by folks who hadn't developed a corresponding moral maturity. That's why his teachings always paired rigorous technical training with character development that completely stamped out destructive motives. The communities he established functioned as living labs, where people could gradually learn to align growing spiritual power with genuine wisdom and compassion. Investigations reveal that Jesus developed sophisticated mentorship systems that allowed individuals to progress through carefully structured stages of development. Beginners picked up basic purification and concentration practices, laying down solid groundwork for more advanced work. Intermediate students sharpened subtle perception skills, enabling them to detect and correct energetic imbalances in themselves and others. Advanced practitioners eventually mastered transformation techniques that could influence complex systems like ecosystems, social structures, and even weather patterns. What made these teachings unique was how Jesus had discovered ways to dramatically accelerate development processes that traditionally required decades of intensive practice. The preserved texts suggest Jesus had identified specific shortcuts that allowed ordinary people to access states of consciousness previously reserved only for masters who dedicated entire lifetimes to spiritual development. These shortcuts weren't easy outs that bypassed necessary work, but rather more efficient methods that cut out unnecessary obstacles and zeroed in on practices yielding the most significant results. He had precisely mapped which elements of traditional Essene training were essential and which were just traditional window dressing, not substantively contributing to real development. Experts have found that Jesus revolutionized spiritual pedagogy by developing teaching methods that adapted to the specific needs and capacities of each individual student. Instead of a one-size-fits-all program, he crafted personalized paths, letting each person advance at their own optimized pace. This individualized approach churned out much faster and more sustainable results than traditional standardized methods. People who'd previously struggled with spiritual practices found they could make extraordinary headway when given guidance, specifically calibrated for their unique makeup and circumstances. The impact of these pedagogical innovations spawned a generation of practitioners with spiritual skills far more developed than anything seen before. Studies suggest Jesus had managed to democratize access to transformative powers that were once monopolized by small, isolated spiritual elites. His communities included folks from all socioeconomic strata who had learned to apply advanced secret prayer techniques with measurable results. This democratization posed a direct threat to established power systems that relied on keeping transformative knowledge locked away within privileged inner circles. The records indicate that Jesus perfectly understood the political implications of his teachings and deliberately structured his communities to minimize unnecessary provocation while maximizing genuine transformative impact. He knew that lasting change required solid foundations that couldn't be easily shattered by external pressures. So he emphasized the development of individual autonomy and community sustainability, making his communities resilient against persecution and interference. People who mastered his techniques became far less dependent on external systems for their well-being and fulfillment, which naturally chipped away at the influence traditional authorities could exert over them. The transformation Jesus introduced to the Essene prayer method peeled back even deeper layers of wisdom when we analyze how he managed to solve fundamental problems that hobbled the effectiveness of traditional practices. Investigations suggest he identified that many of the difficulties people faced trying to master advanced spiritual techniques weren't due to a lack of dedication or inherent ability, but rather conceptual and emotional roadblocks that could be cleared through more sophisticated approaches. He developed specific methods to overcome deep psychological resistances that kept people stuck in limiting patterns, even when they had genuine motivation for change. These methods worked by a gradual but systematic rewiring of how practitioners understood their relationship with spiritual realities, eliminating internal conflicts that sabotaged sincere efforts. The genius of Jesus's approach lay in how he managed to integrate seemingly contradictory elements into coherent systems that produced extraordinary results. Historical sources preserve evidence that he combined deep meditative aspects with active engagement in the world, forging practitioners who were simultaneously contemplative and dynamic. This integration resolved age-old tensions between spiritual life and worldly responsibilities that had fragmented many earlier traditions. People following his methods found that their spiritual practices boosted their effectiveness in all areas of life, instead of competing with other priorities. This synergy eliminated conflicts that traditionally forced individuals to pick between spiritual development and success in relationships, work, or community contributions. Experts have discovered that Jesus had identified universal underlying principles governing all effective forms of prayer, regardless of specific cultural traditions or belief systems. These principles operated based on how human consciousness truly functions at fundamental levels, not on specific dogmas or rituals. This meant his techniques could be adapted to work within practically any cultural or religious context without losing their core punch. people from entirely different backgrounds found they could apply the same basic principles and get comparable results, merely tweaking superficial elements to suit their particular situations. This universality explained how his teachings managed to spread rapidly through diverse cultures that typically resisted outside influences. The academic consensus holds that Jesus had developed verification methods that allowed practitioners to objectively gauge their real progress versus imaginary gains or self-delusion. Many spiritual traditions suffer from a lack of clear criteria to distinguish genuine development from subjective experiences that might feel convincing, but don't translate to substantive change. Jesus crafted feedback systems that cut through this ambiguity using metrics based on observable, real-world outcomes. Practitioners learned to recognize specific indicators for when their practices were sparking authentic transformations versus just generating temporary emotional states or interesting but superficial psychological experiences. This discerning capability protected people from blowing years on ineffective practices and ensured efforts were channeled into methods that produced lasting, measurable changes. Evidence points to how Jesus had understood that effective prayer demands precise alignment across multiple dimensions of human experience simultaneously. Traditional methods often fixated on isolated aspects like thought, emotion, or behavior, but failed to coordinate these different dimensions synergistically. Jesus developed techniques that orchestrated all levels of human experience to work in directed harmony, dramatically multiplying the power of individual practices. When thought, feeling, intention, attention, and bodily action all lined up towards the same specific objectives, the results transcended anything achievable through fragmented efforts. This integral coordination eliminated internal conflicts that bled energy and created states of internal coherence that naturally amplified the effectiveness of any applied practice. Investigations indicate that a crucial part of Jesus' secret methods involved a sophisticated grasp of how timing and context dramatically influence the effectiveness of spiritual practices. He had mapped natural rhythms and cycles governing when different types of prayer yielded their peak results. Some techniques worked best during specific times of day, seasons, or moon phases, while others were more potent during particular states of consciousness or in combination with specific activities. Practitioners who understood these temporal patterns could synchronize their practices with moments of maximized potential, getting substantially more powerful results with less effort. This synchronization also factored in individual personal rhythms that varied between different people, allowing each practitioner to discover their own periods of heightened receptivity and potential. Studies suggest Jesus had developed specific methods for working with unconscious resistance that sabotaged conscious efforts toward change. He recognized that the conscious mind accounts for only a small fraction of the total psyche, and that lasting transformation requires the cooperation of deeper levels that often operate by different logics. His techniques included elegant strategies for communicating with unconscious aspects of the personality in ways they could comprehend and accept. Instead of trying to force change through conscious will alone, he taught methods that naturally persuaded the entire personality to voluntarily collaborate with growth objectives. This internal collaboration eliminated conflicts that traditionally made spiritual development an exhausting struggle and transformed the process into an experience of natural, enjoyable discovery. The discoveries reveal that a revolutionary part of Jesus' approach was how he managed to dramatically accelerate processes that normally took decades of gradual development. He identified that much of the time traditionally needed for mastering spiritual practices was eaten up by unnecessary trial and error, due to a lack of precise guidance on which elements were truly essential versus which were just traditional. Jesus created detailed blueprints showing exactly which skills needed to be developed in what order and which methods most efficiently produced each specific result. Students following these maps could bypass years of unproductive experimentation and immediately zero in on the elements that would generate substantial progress. This efficiency wasn't about cutting corners on quality, but eliminating waste, allowing people to hit levels of development previously considered impossible within a normal lifetime. Some experts propose that Jesus had grasped communal dimensions of prayer that exponentially multiplied the results of individual practices. His techniques included methods for coordinating groups of practitioners so their individual practices mutually reinforced each other instead of merely adding up. When groups applied certain techniques simultaneously, They created resonance fields that amplified the power of each individual participant. These communal practices produced results that transcended anything the same practitioners could achieve working alone, even if they applied the same techniques with equal competence. This group synergy also accelerated individual development. It was like people could learn through a kind of resonance, tapping into others who'd already aced specific skills. They weren't just practicing, they were absorbing capabilities, picking up the know-how through sheer proximity and synchronization. Modern researchers, the folks digging into this stuff today, largely agree. Jesus's hidden methods involved a seriously advanced grasp of how different types of prayer actually hit our neurological and physiological systems in measurable ways. He'd figured out specific techniques that could trigger distinct shifts in brainwave patterns, blood chemistry, immune function, and other biological markers, stuff we can document with today's scientific gear. This physiological bedrock, this hard science, explained why his techniques delivered consistent results, no matter what a practitioner personally believed. They worked through universal biological mechanisms, not just blind faith or wishful thinking. People who applied these methods correctly didn't just feel better. They experienced documented physical changes that backed up and bolstered psychological and spiritual transformations, kicking off positive feedback loops that sped up development across the board. Contemporary research is blowing the lid off this. Jesus had developed a profound understanding of how various states of consciousness could open up a direct line to spiritual dimensions, places usually locked down during our everyday mental grind. The Essene Texts, they're not just dusty old scrolls. They lay out detailed descriptions of the exact techniques Jesus used to induce these altered states, consistently and on demand. Experts have found he'd pinned down natural time windows when the walls between conscious dimensions thinned out, letting practitioners tap into expanded perception with way less effort. These windows popped up at specific points during daily, lunar, and seasonal cycles, and Jesus had meticulously mapped out when each type of practice would hit its peak effectiveness. What's more, he'd also cooked up ways to artificially replicate those natural conditions, meaning folks could access these expanded states regardless of the external timing. The findings suggest Jesus was teaching some truly revolutionary stuff, ways to directly work with vital energy, not just to change your own experience, but to actually reshape the physical environment around you. Historical records hold proof that he'd grasped how human consciousness interacts with subtle energy fields, the invisible stuff that weaves through all physical reality. His techniques were about perceiving, directing, and amplifying these energies through specific combos of mental focus, body posture, controlled breathing, and pinpoint intention. Practitioners who mastered these skills could influence ambient conditions, help heal others, and even manifest physical changes that, to the untrained eye, looked like they were flat out defying known natural laws. But Jesus had figured it out. These weren't violations of scientific principles, but rather the application of deeper laws governing the interplay between consciousness and physical matter. Studies hint that these secret methods included advanced techniques for direct communication with higher intelligences, all through specific protocols that guaranteed crystal clear, precise guidance. Jesus had apparently engineered systems to differentiate between various types of spiritual communication, figuring out which sources were legit and which were either deceptive or just plain inaccurate. He even created verification methods, letting practitioners cross-reference and confirm the authenticity of received guidance through multiple independent channels. These techniques covered purification rituals to prep the mind for clear reception, symbolic codes to translate spiritual info into understandable language, and protective practices to keep communication secure from negative interference. Folks who applied these protocols correctly could establish solid connections with wisdom sources, pulling down practical guidance for the specific challenges of everyday life. Investigations are now revealing that Jesus had a handle on the temporal dimensions of spiritual reality, allowing access to information about past and future events through precise techniques of temporal consciousness expansion. The Essene Texts aren't just telling stories. They preserve descriptions of practices he used to blow past the linear limitations of normal time perception, tapping into perspectives that spanned multiple timelines all at once. He'd figured out that time doesn't tick linearly in spiritual dimensions. It exists as a multidimensional landscape where all moments coexist and can be accessed with the right methods. His techniques involved specific visualizations that moved consciousness through different temporal layers, keeping one foot in the present while exploring past possibilities and future trajectories. Practitioners who mastered these skills could grasp karmic patterns influencing current events, pinpoint the historical roots of contemporary problems, and even perceive the most probable future paths based on present choices. The academic consensus holds that these secret methods included a sophisticated understanding of how psychological and spiritual trauma creates specific blockages, essentially putting the brakes on the natural development of latent human capacities. Jesus had identified that most of the limitations people grapple with weren't a natural lack of ability, but the fallout from wounds that distort perception and restrict access to innate potentials. He developed specific techniques to pinpoint, comprehend, and heal different types of trauma in ways that restored natural function, instead of just slapping a band-aid on the symptoms. His approaches simultaneously tackled the psychological, energetic, and spiritual aspects of healing, recognizing that trauma hits multiple dimensions of a human being and demands an integrated intervention. People who received this healing didn't just get relief from suffering, they experienced a liberation of capabilities that had been lying dormant due to those traumatic blockages. Ever stop to wonder why some folks just seem to have this natural access to spiritual wisdom and power, while others bust their butts trying to develop it for decades? The evidence suggests the difference isn't some special talent, but simply knowing the specific techniques that rip away those artificial roadblocks to natural development. Hit me up in the comments below. Which aspect of these revelations sparks your curiosity the most? Your insights help steer where we dig next into this transformative knowledge. Historical sources maintain that Jesus had developed revolutionary methods for transmitting spiritual knowledge directly, mind to mind, completely bypassing the limits of verbal and conceptual communication. He'd found that the deepest wisdom couldn't be properly articulated with words or symbols. It had to be transferred through direct resonance between expanded states of consciousness. His techniques included specific practices that synchronized the mental states of teacher and student, forging resonance fields where knowledge could flow naturally between participants. This direct transfer was miles more efficient than traditional educational methods, allowing people to absorb a complete grasp of complex concepts in mere moments, not years of gradual study. Students who received knowledge this way didn't just understand it intellectually. They embodied the wisdom, automatically transforming their perception and practical capabilities. Research indicates these secret methods also included advanced techniques for working with group and community energy in ways that jacked up collective consciousness and created environments where individual spiritual development got a serious speed boost. Jesus had figured out that human consciousness operates as an interconnected web, where the mental and spiritual states of individuals within a group influence each other through subtle resonance fields. He developed specific practices to harmonize groups of people, so their individual energies combined into synergistic patterns that benefited everyone involved. These techniques fostered community atmospheres where qualities like compassion, wisdom, mental clarity, and spiritual power were amplified and naturally shared among members. Communities that applied these methods experienced levels of cooperation, creativity, and accomplishment that went way beyond anything individuals could achieve working solo. Experts have uncovered that Jesus had pinpointed specific connections between spiritual practices and the activation of dormant genetic potentials, the stuff that usually lies inactive in most folks their whole lives. He'd grasped that human DNA holds the codes for capabilities far beyond what we typically express, including expanded perception, healing, telepathic communication, and even manipulating physical energy. His techniques featured specific methods to switch on these genetic sequences through precise combinations of spiritual practice, specialized diet, targeted exercises, and controlled exposure to particular energetic frequencies. People who stuck to these protocols experienced measurable physical changes that supported the development of capacities previously written off as impossible or supernatural. This genetic activation wasn't some artificial modification, but a restoration of original human function, lost through centuries of cultural conditioning and environmental degradation. Investigations are revealing that the power behind Jesus' secret methods partly stemmed from his deep understanding of how various spiritual traditions across the globe actually share common elements. When these were properly combined, they produced results that transcended any single system. He'd traveled extensively, studying under masters from a multitude of cultures, extracting universal principles that worked regardless of specific cultural contexts. His techniques synthesized wisdom from Egyptian, Indian, Tibetan, Greek, and other traditions, crafting integrated approaches that captured the essential power of each system while stripping away particular cultural limitations. This synthesis allowed for the development of universal methods that could be effectively applied by people of any cultural background or belief system, operating through fundamental principles of human nature that cut through the superficial differences between spiritual traditions. The discoveries suggest Jesus had a clear grasp of the political and social dimensions of advanced spiritual knowledge, recognizing that certain techniques could pose a real threat to established power structures if they became widely known. He developed careful systems to preserve and transmit the most sensitive knowledge only to students who demonstrated maturity, integrity, and a commitment to using these capabilities responsibly. His precautions weren't about elitism. They sprang from a practical recognition that certain spiritual abilities, if misused, could cause significant harm to both practitioners and others. He devised rigorous tests that assessed a candidate's moral character and emotional stability before ever sharing the more powerful techniques. These security protocols ensured that advanced knowledge stayed in the hands of people who would use it for universal benefit rather than personal gain or manipulating others. Contemporary studies indicate that the methods preserved in the Essene texts include specific techniques for working with natural forces and planetary cycles in ways that dramatically ramped up the effectiveness of spiritual practices. Jesus had understood that the earth functions like a living organism with its own energetic rhythms, and that human practices could be synchronized with these rhythms to maximize results. He developed precise calendars that mapped out when different types of spiritual work would yield optimized benefits, essentially leveraging moments when planetary energies backed specific objectives. His techniques also involved methods for harmoniously engaging with natural elements like water, fire, air, and earth, weaving these forces into practices in ways that multiplied their transformative power. Practitioners who applied these methods found that even simple practices became extraordinarily potent when performed in alignment with the appropriate natural cycles. The consensus among modern researchers holds that Jesus had developed a revolutionary understanding of how the various aspects of human experience, physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual, function as one integrated system that absolutely needs holistic development to hit maximum results. Traditional methods often zeroed in on just one dimension at a time, creating imbalances that capped overall progress and sometimes even kicked back negative side effects. His techniques worked simultaneously with every facet of the human being, ensuring that development in one area supported and beefed up growth in all the others. This integrated approach churned out stable, lasting transformations that improved quality of life on every level all at once. Folks who followed these methods didn't just experience spiritual growth. They also saw improved physical health, boosted emotional stability, expanded mental clarity, and more fulfilling relationships with others. Preserved sources suggest Jesus had nailed down the biggest roadblock to spiritual development for most people. Not a lack of capacity or dedication, but sheer confusion about which practices actually worked versus which were just traditional or popular. He'd observed folks wasting years chasing ineffective methods simply because those methods were widely accepted or touted by respected authorities. His techniques included precise systems for testing the effectiveness of different practices, letting people quickly identify which approaches truly delivered genuine results for their specific circumstances. These evaluation methods saved an enormous amount of time and cut out unnecessary frustration, allowing practitioners to zero in their energy only on activities that directly contributed to their spiritual goals. People who applied these selection criteria found they could hit levels of development in just a few years that previously demanded decades of trial and error. Archaeological and textual evidence are converging to demonstrate that Jesus had grasped the deep connections between individual spiritual development and collective social transformation. He recognized that lasting changes in human society demanded a simultaneous uplift of consciousness at both personal and community levels. He developed specific strategies to kickstart transformation movements that operated through authentic spiritual growth, rather than just superficial political or economic shifts. His approaches zeroed in on developing spiritual leadership that could inspire and guide others through personal example and practical wisdom, creating waves of positive influence that naturally spread through social networks. These strategies acknowledge that sustainable social change has to emerge from genuine inner transformation, and that external systems only really stick when the people running them experience a true elevation of consciousness and character. Research is revealing that these secret techniques included advanced methods for blowing past the normal limitations of human perception and tapping into levels of reality where information about the fundamental nature of existence becomes directly accessible. Jesus had found that human consciousness packs innate capacities to perceive dimensions of reality that stay invisible to our normal physical senses and ordinary conceptual thought. His practices involved specific techniques to expand perception beyond usual sensory limits, allowing for direct experience of spiritual principles that typically can only be grasped intellectually. People who developed these expanded perceptual capacities gained access to wisdom that fundamentally reshaped their understanding of life's purpose, the nature of reality, and true human potential. This direct wisdom provided practical guidance that sharpened decision-making in every area of life, from personal relationships to career choices and contributions to the collective good. Contemporary investigations suggest Jesus had the foresight to anticipate that advanced spiritual knowledge would eventually be validated by modern scientific discoveries. He'd structured his teachings in ways that would remain relevant and applicable, even as humanity's understanding of physical reality evolved. He'd grasped that authentic spiritual truths don't contradict genuine scientific findings. Rather, they complement and expand upon them, offering perspectives on dimensions of reality that traditional scientific methods simply can't probe directly. His techniques were designed to churn out measurable results that could be documented and verified through objective criteria, even when they operated through principles that transcended contemporary scientific paradigms. That foresight allowed his methods to stay relevant and effective through centuries of cultural shifts and technological progress, working just as well in ancient times as they do today. The converging evidence points to this. Jesus' secret methods represent a masterful synthesis of practical spiritual wisdom, capable of profoundly and lastingly transforming human experience when applied with the right understanding and consistent dedication. These teachings lay out pathways for developing capacities most folks chalk up as impossible, but which are, in reality, natural potentials of human consciousness, just waiting to be switched on through correct practices. The knowledge preserved in the Essene texts provides detailed blueprints for navigating these transformative possibilities, offering practical guidance that anyone willing to invest the necessary time and energy can apply to master these techniques. The rediscovery of this knowledge marks a historic opportunity for humanity to reconnect with forgotten dimensions of human potential and forge ways of living that integrate higher spiritual achievements with effective participation in contemporary society. People who seriously commit to studying and applying these methods find they can not only transform their own lives, but contribute to the general uplift of human consciousness, something our era desperately needs to successfully navigate the complex challenges we face as a species. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. I'll catch you in the next one.